Welcome to today's episode of Questions of Democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. I'm your host, Hugo, and today we are diving into a pressing and complex topic, democratic backsliding in Central Europe and its connection to migration. Over the past decade, countries like Hungary, Czechia and Slovakia have been at the center of debates about the erosion of democratic norms and rising populism. To help us unpack this, I'm joined by an incredible group of experts. João, our expert on Hungary, Jiri, who will cover the developments in Czechia, George, bringing us insights from Slovakia, Eliška, specializing in democratic backsliding, and Yannick, our migration policy expert. So, to start us off, Eliška, what today is political backsliding and why it is a pressing issue in Central Europe today?
Over the past years, democratic backsliding has become a defining trend in global politics. The current growing crisis of democracy is accompanied by the rise of populist parties, the return of authoritarian regimes, and xenophobic sentiment, fueled by a particularly strong wave of immigration. Moreover, fear and anxiety, and I'm also talking about the field of employment opportunities, are one of the many sources of power of anti-democratic factors. Democratic backsliding is a process of a long-term nature. It usually appears in discrete changes in the field of legal rules and informal procedures that accompany elections, right protections, and responsibility. It is spread over time, stretching for months or even years, going faster when people are more adaptable to the changes being introduced. Therefore, it may not be so easy to even notice the backsliding is actually happening in the country. I'll borrow the theoretical basis from an American political scientist, Nancy Bermeo, who believes that the term democratic backsliding refers to the state-directed weakening or elimination of any political institution that preserves an existing democracy. Bermeo comes up with three current manifestations, from which I chose two: executive aggrandizement and strategic harassment and manipulation. The democratic backsliding by increasing the power of the executive, which is the first one I mentioned, probably takes the most time to happen. It does not count on a change of government as such, but on the gradual weakening of the principle of the checks and balances and the initiation of institutional changes aimed at limiting the power of opposition forces. The second one is the strategic harassment and manipulation. This type of democratic backsliding can be characterized by restricting the freedom of the press, its manipulation in favor of a certain political group, and changes in electoral law, and etc. But all in the nature of the election not looking problematic at all. This is more long-term planning, rarely explicitly illegal, unlike in Georgia with the imprisonment of political opponents, for example. To complement the theoretical basis by Bermeo, I will also add the structural breakdown of democratic backsliding by authors Lust and Waldner, who also mention political leaders and international factors among their 6 basic theoretical focuses of change. Starting with the political leaders, it is not meant only as a participation in the government as such, but as such a position in which the actions of the leader are not significantly limited by the actions of another leader. A strong core of this leader's abilities are his intelligence, the ability to make strategic decisions, and of course his ability to influence people. As to say, they need to be a persona. This can be seen, for example, in Hungary's Viktor Orbán or Slovak Robert Fico. In the Czech Republic, such persona can be seen in the leader of the current opposition and former Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. And the second mentioned focus is international factors, whose initiator is an external force that acts from the outside on domestic actors in an attempt to alter and shape their behavior. We can recognize this in the bilateral relations between Russia and Hungary, and also Russia and Slovakia in recent years, with Fico being the prime minister again. All in all, the democratic backsliding is a pressing issue in the CEE region because even though the countries are members of the European Union, which should somehow watch out for democratic backsliding, The European Parliament called for action against the erosion of EU values in member states in February this year, which is alarming.
Thank you, Eliška. So, Yannick, why has it become such a polarizing issue in Central Europe, despite historically the low levels of immigration?
Yes, I'll briefly be going over the migration policy and explain why it has become such a pressing issue. Now, first off, we have internal migration. This is migration between member states. As such, 1.5 million EU citizens have migrated from one EU country to another. We have, however, noticed clear regional differences. The east and southeastern part of Europe has a large amount of migration towards Western and Northern Europe, most often due to work or educational reasons. This has, however, caused a brain drain and is putting massive pressure on social and economic systems in the region. And conversely, in the northwest and some southern parts of Europe, we have seen a large influx of people, which has caused the failing of some migration systems due to the combination with a large external migration influx from third countries. Now, for external migration, we can see that about 7 million people migrated to the European Union and 2.7 million people left the EU, leaving us with a net positive of 4.3 million. Now, whilst irregular migration is most often discussed, it should be known that this only accounts for about 9% of the average, according to the latest numbers of 2022. Last year, about 1 million people sought asylum and 400,000 people were granted protection, where most applicants are lodged in Germany, France, and Italy. Now, in terms of the effectiveness of the migration policy, we have noticed a clear rise in the backlog of pending applications. We can see a high degree of variation between the processing speeds between the member states and varying recognition rates between member states. Now, the migration policy mainly leans on two pillars. First off, we have the Schengen Agreement for internal border control, where we have noticed an underlying need for more control as there have become more issues apparent. And the second part, for the external flow, is the new Pact on Migration and Asylum that focuses on a common EU framework, providing more support for struggling member states on the external borders. Now, in terms of the problem of populism and the politicization of migration policy, we have noticed that migration has become one of the most contentious issues in the EU, and warnings have been made towards the increasing political nature of the issue. There has been a rise in tension due to migration issues and rights in the EU cooperation, and it has caused tearing in the European apparatus, undermining political will and mutual cooperation. The Visegrad Four have shown the most ardent opposition towards any form of reform proposals on the EU migration policy, adopting a staunch anti-immigration stance. Migration has been securitized by most of the Union member states, as it is now seen as an existential threat towards safety, security, and the welfare state, resulting in polarizing politics and radical policy choices. This comes hand in hand with rising populist rhetoric in EU member states, where populist actors are claiming to represent the will of the people, and a large fraction of their policy does rely on migration issues. Now, populism can best be understood as an expression of deep-seated problems in the European Union, and this is mainly due to the tensions of the plurality of identities present in society. Now, there is now an overarching fear that the increasing political nature of the migration issue is going to have more far-reaching consequences that could possibly tear the Union from the inside out, as cooperation between the member states is eroding at this very moment.
Thank you, Yannick. So, George, considering the latest developments, how is Slovakia pushing against migration?
Right, so in Slovakia, right, for a really long time, what we saw were very low number of migrants, right? The nationals to third country nationals, and we are excluding the European Union citizens here, have been historically low, but even so, you see that the asylum seekers that try to get into Slovakia rarely manage to pass the screening process and everything. And nonetheless, what we are seeing recently is that Slovakia having a lot of immigration, Slovak citizens living for other EU countries, primarily the Czech Republic and Germany, Austria, and other countries in the EU. With this immigration, you do still have to fill up the jobs that are happening in Slovakia. So what they've been doing recently is make the processes of applying for jobs easier, both for European citizens coming into Slovakia and for third country nationals, and integrating the Ukrainian citizens that are also increasing, of course, following the 2022 Russian invasion. And they get to work as a Slovak citizen as soon as they go into the country, right? And even so, with all these policies that have been implemented to try to use citizens as a third country nationals as a way to fill up the labor market, you still see a quite strong resentment towards immigrants. They do not have the same opportunities as the Slovak citizens, even though they do formally have the same rights. But even so, we do have to make the point that there is a slow process after all, and immigration is on the rise in Slovakia, so it is a ongoing discussion, I believe.
Thank you, George. Next, Iri. The anti-immigration rhetoric has also surfaced in Czechia. How do politicians use migration to appeal to voters?
Well, basically what you're referring is instrumentalization of migration issue. Since 2015, in the context of European migration crisis, migration has become one of the main topics in election campaigns. Political parties and movements such as ANO, SPD and some far-right entities have utilized the migration issue to mobilize voters through fear-mongering and claims of culture destruction, while using simplistic rhetoric as threat to security and protecting of cultural values. As Eliška mentioned, these parties have the strong leaders, those populist leaders, which are, I would say, biased to backsliding in this country. Using the migration is basically strengthening the nationalism. We can see it on polarizing of society, increased intolerance toward minorities, but particularly Muslims and Africans. But in the last years, even Ukraine wants. Even in the scope of politicians often empathize, defending sovereignty against the EU's supposed pressure to accept refugees. I quote. Well, the rhetoric is basically the migration from Arab and African countries is portrayed as a primary threat, often accompanied by imagery of violence, terrorism, or culture aversion, invasion. For instance, during Tomio Okamura's SPD campaign, the emphasis was placed on the need to reject migrants, despite the fact that the Czech Republic accepts only a minimal number of people from these regions. Actual numbers are really funny compared to these statements, because the migrants from Arab and African countries account for only a small fraction of the migration population in the Czech Republic. Over recent decades, most migrants have come from Ukraine, Slovakia, Vietnam and Russia. And in 2022, for example, refugees from Ukraine represented more than 90% of newly arrived migrants, while asylum seekers from the Middle East or Africa remained minimal in the hundreds per year. The Czech Republic has long accepted the fewest asylum seekers per capita in the entire EU. Well, we can see this disparity between rhetoric and reality. Politicians deliberately extricate the threat posed by migrants from Arab and African countries, mostly from SPD and the far-right parties, despite their negligible real impact on the Czech Republic. studies show that Czechs have the great aversion to migrants from these countries, like the Middle Eastern countries and African ones, while migrants from Slovakia, Ukraine and Vietnam are generally perceived positively. This is largely due to cultural proximity and long-standing coexistence with some communities, meaning Vietnamese. Vietnamese migration is a really good example of integration. Little from history. In socialist era, migrants from Vietnam began go to the country through the intergovernmental agreements between socialist countries. Vietnamese migrants were initially accepted as workers or students under state programs, but after 1989, after collapse of socialism in Czech Republic, used to be Czechoslovakian, some of these migrants choose to remain in the Czech Republic rather than returning to Vietnam. From 1990s onward, a wave of economic migration began, with the Vietnamese people moving to Czech Republic for business and entrepreneurial opportunities. The number of Vietnamese migrants grew significantly, especially after the Czech Republic joined the EU in 2004, making it an attractive destination. So basically, you're right. The migration is really used for campaigns in Czech Republic. Some of them parties are really using the issues with migration, but it's really not an issue in the country.
Finally, João, Hungary is frequently cited as the leading example of political backsliding. What are the most important changes Viktor Orban's government has made to consolidate power?
Well, Hungary is a very interesting topic in the question of backsliding and migration politics. As of 2014, Fidesz and Viktor Orban have labeled Hungary a illiberal democracy. That is, a democracy made to attend to the rights and the interests of a very specific portion of the population. In Hungary's case, Catholic Hungarians, which are straight and traditional. The arrival of immigrants has been very negatively addressed by the government, as Viktor Orban and the party have continuously used invasion rhetoric against these individuals, especially of a Muslim background, given Hungary's historic position as a bulwark against the advances of the Ottoman Empire. However, out of Hungary's 9.6 million population, there are around 400,000 migrants, which are a non-negligible part of the population. Given this rupture with the party doctrine of, serving the traditional Hungarians, Viktor Orban has used this population and this increasing number of non-Hungarian people to his advantage, promulgating a series of laws and addresses to the constitution, which empower the current parties in power, especially Fidesz, and it culminates especially with the Defense of Sovereignty law, which was very recently introduced in Hungary, which would give the government the ability to cease and desist any civilian society organizations which receive funding from outside of Hungary, which specifically targets institutions funded by Brussels and institutions funded by and set up by immigrant households and families, which would by definition need to receive this money from outside. Which means that the immigrant issue has been a tool continuously used and exploited by Fidesz and especially Viktor Orban to increase his hold over the Hungarian parliament and power.
Thank you, João, and thank you again to all of our experts for those insights. In conclusion, we found that democratic backsliding remains a pressing issue in Central Europe, even as these countries are EU members, expected to uphold democratic values. The increasing politicization of migration further deepens the division, threatening not only regional stability but also the cohesion of the European Union. We see Hungary leading with an extreme approach. Czechia shows signs of caution, and Slovakia's recent shift adds to the complexity, highlighting the urgent need for cooperation and vigilance to protect democracy in the region. This has been a fascinating discussion on the intersection of political backsliding and migration in Central Europe. Thank you to our listeners.